G'day guys, this is potentially the most boring training related video I've ever done, but also the most important. If you've watched any of my other training related videos, you should be aware of the information in this video because it sits above pretty much everything else in terms of getting fitter as a cyclist. When you train as a cyclist, there are central adaptations and peripheral adaptations. The central adaptations are related to the heart and the blood. How much blood can the heart pump out? And what are the contents of the blood, the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood? There are also the peripheral adaptations, which are related to the muscle, the mitochondria, the oxidative enzymes. In most of the cycling media and the training related space, you'll hear most often discussion of training principles as they relate to the peripheral adaptation. So anytime anyone's talking about mitochondria and fat oxidation and zone 2 training, most of that is discussed in relation to how it affects the muscle peripherally. Very rarely will you see people discuss training adaptations as they relate to the blood. A logical question you might have at this point is, when I'm training, what percent of the increases in my fitness are related to the peripheral adaptations in the muscle versus the central adaptations to the heart and the blood? This depends on the level of experience of the rider and then also the performance outcomes that you're related to. You know, the adaptation makeup for improving your 6-hour power versus your 4-minute power are going to be different. But just to give you an example, if you take healthy subjects that are untrained but yet healthy, this study here, they trained them for 6 weeks doing sprint interval training, which was 3 sessions a week with 6 maximal 30-second sprints. Pretty standard sort of protocol to elicit an improvement in VO2 max. Over those 6 weeks, these subjects saw a 11% improvement in VO2 max. This was a very complex study which measured multiple parameters related to central and peripheral adaptations, and the authors estimated that in that population that had 11% improvement in 6 weeks in their VO2 max, about 55% was related to an increase in blood volume, which is going to be an increase in plasma volume, which is the suspension fluid in the blood, and an increase in the hemoglobin mass. So around half of the improvement they saw was related to the blood. I don't know about you, but I find that quite interesting and almost shocking that half the adaptations that come at VO2 max for a healthy but untrained population is related to a parameter which rarely gets discussed in the training space. I want to take this one step further and give you some insight into the level of monitoring of blood that a professional cyclist will do throughout a training block. I want to pull out a few snippets here from this fascinating study following the Australian team pursuit team that broke the world record in 2018, tracking their training load for about 8 months before they broke the world record. And then along with their training load, they tracked their hemoglobin mass and their blood values, and also tracked their 4-minute peak power across that 8 months, so that the researchers could pull links between hemoglobin mass, 4-minute power, and then general training load overall in terms of CTL. When you're looking at the blood of an athlete, there are a few parts that will improve performance. The first part is the plasma volume. That plasma volume is essentially the suspension fluid in the blood, which all the other parts of the blood sit, which makes up essentially the volume of the blood. So more blood overall, more plasma volume can improve performance. And the other part is the hemoglobin mass. The hemoglobin is the protein in the blood, on the red blood cells, that picks up the oxygen and carries it around. That is the thing that you want to increase as you're training. The first important finding in this study is that when training in temperate conditions, meaning just general sort of mid 20 degrees, maximal and sub-maximal performance, so peak 4-minute power, VO2 max, LT1, which is the start of zone 2, and LT2, which is equivalent sort of to FTP, those parameters are positively related to hemoglobin mass and hemoglobin. So the more hemoglobin mass you've got, the higher your zone 2 power, the higher your zone 4 power, the higher your peak 4-minute power. It's all related to hemoglobin mass. Another key finding of the study was that CTL was positively related to hemoglobin mass. So over these 8 months, as the athletes did their training and the CTL increased. Now, the CTL didn't go crazy, interesting enough. The CTL never actually went over 120, which is not that high for a professional athlete, an Olympic athlete that these riders are. So as CTL increased, as they did more training, coming closer to their world record attempt, hemoglobin mass responded and increased in line with the increase in CTL. This was an observational relationship. So obviously, if you train and raise your CTL, there's no guarantee that your hemoglobin mass is going to increase. And that's what I'm going to get into in a little bit, is as you're doing training to increase your CTL, if you want to see an increase in power, you need this middle link. This middle link is the hemoglobin. So you need to make sure you not only do the training to raise the CTL, you are recovering and supporting your blood values to increase the hemoglobin mass, which will give you the increase in the power. You can't go from one to the other without the hemoglobin. The riders in this study were already professional athletes, which means at the start of their training block, their hemoglobin is already going to be pretty high. If you're an untrained rider or less experienced, you have less of a training background, the potential you have to increase your training load and then increase your hemoglobin and see an improvement in performance is going to be greater because you have more room to grow in terms of the hemoglobin response. Professional athletes are less sensitive to training-induced changes in hemoglobin mass compared to recreationally trained athletes, as their hemoglobin mass has already increased in response to training, making further increases more difficult to achieve. That's why if you're a professional athlete, you might go to altitude or do a heat acclimation block to stimulate a bit more of an increase in hemoglobin because you've already sort of maxed out that pathway. If you're not already a trained athlete, you've got more room to grow in this. And so it means you need to be more focused on the recovery aspect to support the formation of hemoglobin. So the big question, how do you support an increase in hemoglobin mass as you raise your CTL while you're training? First part of helping your body increase hemoglobin as you do training and see your CTL go up is not seeing your hemoglobin go down. The maintenance is really important. So, key part of that, don't overtrain. Overtraining, under recovery, not eating enough calories, not eating enough carbohydrates, anything that's going to have a hormonal impact, a drop in testosterone, anything, dehydration, under recovery, anything in terms of the recovery side of things that's detracting from your recovery is going to impact your hemoglobin levels. So as an overall, the building block of having a good hemoglobin is being healthy and recovering well. It's very boring, but avoiding at all costs symptoms of overtraining is the foundation of seeing a hemoglobin increase. Next thing is that there are certain nutrients which assist in red blood cell formation. You'll probably already know these. Iron, vitamin B12, folate, vitamin C in conjunction with the iron to assist the uptake. Vitamin D to keep you healthy and keep your immunity up. These are things that you need to make sure you're getting enough of. Do you need to supplement with these? Not necessarily. How do you know if you're getting enough of these? You can only know if you get a blood test. It's a no-brainer really to me to get a blood test to test for this thing. So you firstly test for your hemoglobin. The problem with testing for hemoglobin is that it's a concentration as a percentage of your blood. It's in units per liter. As you get dehydrated, in the short term, your hemoglobin might look like it's high. Or if you go training in the heat and you're really well hydrated and your blood volume's expanded, you might look like you have low hemoglobin when you get a blood test. So just getting a blood test for hemoglobin isn't the be-all and end-all. And most of these research, they're testing hemoglobin mass, which is measuring the total amount of hemoglobin in the blood. You and I can't get a hemoglobin mass test because it requires this complex carbon monoxide rebreathing, which we can't get access to. So purely alone, just doing a test once a year and seeing what your hemoglobin is not that useful because it fluctuates a lot. So the things in a blood test you're looking for are, how are my nutrients that support red hemoglobin formation? Ferritin is a protein in the blood that stores iron. This is probably the best way to measure your iron stores. Iron's crucial in creating red blood cells. You can look up reference ranges online. I don't want to give medical advice. Personally, I like to keep my ferritin above 60. I'm usually between 100 and 150 in the previous blood tests I've had. Vitamin B12, again, you can look up reference ranges for those. There's studies that have tested optimal hemoglobin range for athletes. From the studies I've seen, generally above 700 pg per ml. Just check the units on that as well. If you're in Australia, at least, the units are in pmol per litre. A lot of the research is in pg per ml. Vitamin D, you can look up reference ranges for those. I think around above about 40 nanograms per milliliter is what they recommend. Check that yourself though. And folate, above 7 nanograms per milliliter from the research I could see as well. If you're really serious about training, you really, really should be getting these tested. It's just super important. Your body is going to struggle to form new hemoglobin molecules if you don't have the building blocks. This is not me saying go out and just supplement these things up the wazoo and it'll boost your hemoglobin. Having more of these doesn't mean you're going to form more hemoglobin. But if you're low in these, your body's not going to be able to form new hemoglobin. So you need to help your body out while it's training. So go and get these tested. Don't just do guesswork. If you find you're low in some of these, or your doctor finds you're low in some of these, you can take steps to remedy that, whether that's through diet or perhaps some supplementation if you need it. So that's 2 steps. You've got, firstly, being a healthy athlete who's not overtraining, who has healthy hormone levels and who's recovering well. Then you've got provide your body with the nutrients to form new hemoglobin. And then there's other things you can do training-wise to increase that. Like you'll see riders go to altitude and do altitude camps to increase hemoglobin. You can potentially, depending on how well the heat protocol is done, is stimulate an increase in hemoglobin through a heat acclimation protocol. I'd say that's probably easier to do for most people than going to altitude, although they're very niche and quite hard to implement, and most people aren't going to bother doing those sorts of things. And then obviously there's the doping thing, which I'm not going to get into, but athletes will dope to increase their hemoglobin. It's worth sort of saying. And that's just more a reflection of how crucial the hemoglobin mass aspect of the central adaptations are to the overall package of training adaptations as a whole. I think I'll end the video there, guys. This is a pretty big, broad one to cover, but I just would like you, if you're watching my videos, just be aware of your health, be aware of your training, be aware of your diet, and if you are serious about training and seeing improvements in your performance, you will likely need to get your hemoglobin up or keep it at a healthy high level. And to do that, you're going to need to be at least thinking about it and implementing some of the things that you saw in this video. That's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, got something out of it, and I'll catch you in the next one.